some 38% of all IMF programs have not been completed. Sri Lanka's average is about 50%. So half of all programs that the IMF has put Sri Lanka into, we've completed, and the other half we've failed. So now, some of these programs, the argument is that they've led to greater inequality and more social issues in the case of some of the IMF programs being implemented. So I wonder what you think of this particular experience, because even in Sri Lanka, we've seen that the IMF have come in, they've given us a policy protocol. And of course, in the meantime, there's going to be people falling through the cracks, into poverty, etc. So obviously, Sri Lanka had, by the time we got to this point, we had nowhere else to turn other than the IMF. But could you also, while accepting that the IMF necessarily must be part of the current solution, given where we are, could you also critique the past of the IMF's past in briefly for us, if you could just give us something?
It kind of reminds me, because the main argument put forward when let's say people like me who criticize the IMF's policies, not just in Sri Lanka but everywhere in the world throughout the IMF's history, the defenders of, let's say, the defenders of those policies usually say, well, those countries that didn't succeed after those policies didn't follow through with the program. Now there I'm reminded of sort of this scene where someone is sending out a boxer into the ring, and the coach says to the boxer, right, go and fight now, but keep one hand behind your back, throughout the whole match. Obviously punches are going to be flying in at some point, and the boxer has a choice: either go down or remove the arm from the back and start fighting properly. And for me, it's like that. So we were already discussing what happens when another external shock, similar to COVID, maybe not a virus, but something else coming from the global economy, hits Sri Lanka. The government has to then support the economy. Every economy does that in the world when a shock like that comes. We saw it during COVID. Maybe they give a bit of tax relief temporarily, not there to stay. They also, expand the social welfare net and all of that. So naturally that creates a budget deficit. Now, that's why I think this program will not be followed through. And I think it's no different from the 16 programs in the past, not because a government will come along that, purposely abandons it just for the sake of it, for ideological purposes or whatever, but because they will have no choice. And that is because what is not recognized in the policies is what is the long-term strategy for getting Sri Lanka on that path of development. Rapid growth, foreign exchange earnings. Those two are critical, and I don't see how the policies are going to lead to these two. They argue that they do, because the arguments are when you bring inflation under control, naturally the growth rate starts rising. If you keep a flexible exchange rate, you'll have no problems on the balance of payments. These are all the standard arguments.
The theoretical arguments.
The theoretical arguments, but what we see in reality is something completely different. We see that the government has to actually push in the manufacturing sector, create that export dynamism in the manufacturing sector, and something that is not supposed to be there in all the successful East Asian countries for standard economics is massive foreign exchange reserves. You look at Korea, Taiwan, now Vietnam, they have massive amounts. Why? Because they know once in a while a shock comes along and they have to be resilient. Okay. Yet, what is the plan for Sri Lanka to build up that cushion? I don't see it at the moment.
Talal, what do you think? I mean, the fact what's basically being proposed here is that if you're saying that 38% of all IMF programs have not been completed in the IMF's history, it stands to reason that perhaps the reforms themselves and the pressures that the reforms place on ordinary people end up creating the political pressure whereby eventually the government just has to let go of the IMF and try to chart its own course. There's definitely going to be a danger of that happening in Sri Lanka as well. I mean, the political pressures are already mounting. So, do you feel confident, I mean, just briefly, before we get on to our next question, because I want to get onto the Central Bank Act as well, but just briefly, do you think this IMF program can succeed? I've read and I've heard some economists say that in many ways this IMF program is not intensive enough, that there's no growth even in 2026, 2027, or maybe there's a very small amount of growth. So these seem like very, very contrasting positions. And it seems like Sri Lanka's policies, even if we follow through with the IMF, may not necessarily get us to where we're going. But then on the other hand, what options do we have? So how do you just unpack that? I know it's a bit complicated.
Right. Okay. So to answer that, first of all, Sri Lanka is an example of what would happen to a country if it didn't go to the IMF. So last year in July, we saw what happened. I mean, the IMF wasn't here.
Yeah.
So if we had gone to the IMF in 2020, obviously it's up to I totally agree that we need to move into an export-oriented industry. But the primary goal of the IMF right now would be macroeconomic stability. So that is also, I mean, that also we cannot, offshore to the IMF. So Sri Lanka, we saw the effects of what a country would go through if we didn't go to the IMF. So about 3 weeks with no fuel, 12-hour power cuts. So, but most other countries, it's seen because before they hit the rock bottom, as they are sliding down to near zero, they go to the IMF. So while they hit the rock bottom, it's blamed on the IMF. And usually with just as Sri Lanka, it doesn't, an IMF program does not transform the country immediately into an export-oriented industry and increase the reserves, but it brings stability. So once stability is there, obviously any political party wants to move towards populist policies.
Right.
And then obviously what is right for the country is not right for the politicians.
Okay.
And naturally they go away from the IMF program. So,
Okay.
but in Sri Lanka's case, I think that it's quite different compared to the other ones, because this time we are going as a bankrupt country.
Right.
And another point I always emphasize is that, even if it's reprofiling, China, India, Japan, they're all taking some form of a cut.
Right.
And it's in their interest that they make Sri Lanka toe the line.
Yes.
You see, one thing is, of course, the IMF program is strict and because it has to be, our situation is so bad.
Right.
But the thing is, like, there is no other alternative at the moment. I mean, last year, if it wasn't for India, there was no one else. And it's just like, even though the Chinese or others see the IMF as a US influenced organization, they all abide by it,
Right.
It's like no organization in the world has the clout to bring the US, China, Japan, the ISP holders to the same table.
Right.
It's still sort of like in the corporate sector, how you call the big four, the auditors.
Okay.
So that plays a role. But I agree that, but of course the IMF's primary role as they came in was not to transform the country into an export-oriented organization. It was to bring some sort of stability,
Right.
which I believe has been achieved, though there is a long way to go.